I work in addiction ministry, primarily with families who have a loved one in addiction. I have written 2 books on addiction. Just in case you are interested, it's called Set Free: Finding Truth and Hope When a Loved One is Addicted. And so my story is kind of a different one. Finally fell on his face before God, and God miraculously delivered him from any urges to drink alcohol. And he spent the rest of his fairly short life in addiction ministry. First in the city of Philadelphia. He started several rescue missions. He would do street meetings. He would do all kinds of things to reach out to those who were just enslaved. Especially back then, it was alcohol. So in 1897, he had the idea from God to find a place away from the influences. And so $1.87 capital, but they purchased 600 acres in the pinelands of New Jersey. At that time, it was very remote, not so much anymore. But he founded what was called America's Keswick Colony of Mercy. And that has just grown through the years. So that's where I grew up. My grandfather was the director, and then my father was the director. And so I thought I knew a lot about addiction because I grew up around it. But what I grew up with was men who would come in. At that time, it was only men who were in the program. Now they have a women's work also. But the men would come in. They would be there for 3 months or 4 months, and families would be united, oftentimes, not always. And oftentimes the men would go out and live a victorious Christian life. And so that was my exposure to it. What I didn't understand was a very different side of that. And 2 of my 5 children ended up in addiction, which completely floored me. I had no idea what to do. I had no idea why they would do that. They grew up at Keswick. They grew up in the church. They went to Christian school. I didn't get it at all. And the other thing that I did not understand was, what was my role in dealing with the addiction? What did I need to do to help them? Because I ended up doing everything wrong. I guess that's in a sense, the good thing is that it allowed me to be able to help other people. And so, so much of my ministry is working with women who have a loved one in addiction, and they're making the same mistakes that I made. But because I'm able to teach and support and help them, it's just a real privilege to use those really painful things that happened with my 2 kids and to be able to allow God to use that. So I know a lot more about addiction now than I did 20 years ago, I have to say. And I understand the roots of addiction. So we're going to be talking about that. I'll say tonight, since it's tonight there, it's morning here, but addiction does not only impact the person who is in addiction, it impacts the people around them. And so therefore, when we don't understand addiction, when we don't understand what they're going through, we tend to think that we can fix them. And that's the opposite of what we need to do. So I have some statistics which should be on your notes, and they're regarding this country. There is an epidemic of addiction. In 2022, there were 110,236 drug overdose deaths in this country. Now, that is not taking into account the fact that many people have access to Narcan, which, if it's an opioid, can reverse the overdose and bring them back to life. And there are people who have been Narcaned multiple times. So if it weren't for Narcan, those drug overdose deaths would be much, much higher. And so the result of that is that almost everybody in this country has been impacted, either within their direct family or they know people who have been impacted by drug overdose deaths. There was one young lady I talked to who had graduated from high school a few years before we talked. And out of her class in school, there were about 21 overdose deaths of people that she knew right in her graduating class. So this is impacting families at a rate that is unprecedented. So yesterday I did some research on the problem in India, and I found an article from the Times of India that was published May 3rd of this year. And the headline was, "Problem of Drug Abuse Among Adolescents Likely to Explode in the Next Decade." And I just want to give you some of the highlights of that article. They're talking about age 10 to 17 being the biggest population that is being impacted in India. And they listed things like mental health issues, performance pressure, growing emptiness, and changing socioeconomic conditions. And this is across the board in both urban and rural India. And so they listed 3 trends. Now, obviously, this is not coming from a Christian perspective, but they are speaking so clearly into the things that I'm going to be talking about. So the trends are, the first one is glamorization of intoxication and addiction substances in media. So I assume that's television, that's whatever social media they're involved in, movies. There's glamorizing intoxication and use of e-cigarettes and vaping. And what is touted by some people as a way to avoid cigarettes actually can be even more of a gateway, according to one of the doctors that was quoted, for when they're vaping in this country especially, and I don't know there, but I assume it's the same. They're not always just vaping nicotine products. They're vaping other things like marijuana and other drugs. And then the third thing, and this is huge, rising mental health issues related to performance pressure and growing emptiness among children. And this has spiked drastically with COVID-19. And the 2 things that they mentioned was emptiness and isolation. So in this country, isolation led to an enormous spike in drug addiction and alcohol addiction, especially alcohol addiction. But both of them, each year, the drug overdose death rate has increased exponentially, and especially since COVID-19. And when we look at the impact of that, yes, the impact medically is there, but the impact socially and emotionally, people are in despair. They don't know what to do with the emptiness, with the pain that's inside. And unless you know the Lord and you know where we're going, yes, it is sad when we lose a loved one maybe because of COVID or some other illness. But when we know where they're going, that heaven is what's awaiting us, it doesn't have the same impact. But for people who don't know the Lord, for people who have no hope, they have no assurance of life afterwards. And so people start saying, why am I here? Where did I come from? And where am I going? The three main philosophical questions that all people have. Where am I here and where am I going? And until we have the assurance of hope, of relationship with Jesus Christ, and of hope of a future, there is that emptiness, that what has happened with COVID all across the world is that people are waking up and saying, I'm scared. I don't know what this looks like. I don't know what happens after death. And so that has deeply, deeply impacted the rates of addiction. So to really understand addiction, and I know all of you are studying through Grace Fellowship India, and understanding the victorious Christian life, and how to put it into practice. And so we talk about that we are made in the image of God. So God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And God created us to be three parts also. So we have a spirit, which is the part of us that relates to God. And we have a soul, which is the part of us that relates to other people. So will and emotion. Or I like to say it, our thinker, our feeler, and our chooser. And the body relates to the world around us, but we are integrated. All of those things work together. All of those parts work together. So when our body is impacted by something, it affects our soul and our spirit. And so there is interaction between them. But I believe that addiction is a soul issue that has physical manifestations and a spiritual solution. So my definition for addiction, because I think a lot of times we think we know what addiction is. We say, okay, well, somebody just keeps drinking and drinking and drinking and they won't stop, so they're addicted. Or somebody keeps shooting up drugs or smoking drugs or doing whatever, and they just keep doing that, and that's what addiction is. But it is so much more than that, so much deeper. And if we take that kind of simplistic view of addiction, we will not be effective in being able to help other people or being able to understand dealing with this. And one thing I want to say is, if you have questions, I know I'm kind of going along fairly quickly because I want to make sure that there's time at the end for questions, but please feel free to write down a question or something, because I would be glad to attempt to answer it. So, and if there's something that you don't understand as I'm going along, I understand that there's somewhat of a language difference as far as my American accent versus what you're used to. So I apologize if I'm not understandable at times, but I would be glad to clarify anything. So hopefully you have the notes in front of you, because my definition of addiction is pretty comprehensive. So addiction is a self-soothing, ritualized habit that is based on emotional pain, usually from childhood experiences, and can be destructive to the individual and to those around him or her. It is a coping skill, a deeply entrenched habit of desire and reward, with its roots in unhealed emotional pain. The brain circuitry plays a part in the habit, but it's not the cause nor the cure of the habit. And I'll talk about that part a little bit later. The thing I want to go back to is addiction is a self-soothing, ritualized habit. And that's something that we don't understand. People think, well, the person in addiction is chasing a high. They just want to get high. And that is true in a sense, although when somebody has used, whether it's an opiate or meth or any of those, the high is not there. It's not the same. And so what the person in addiction is trying to do is actually numb the pain. So when we say that it's a self-soothing, ritualized habit, self-soothing in the sense of numbing the bad feelings that they have. So those bad feelings may stem from things that happened in their childhood. It can stem from all kinds of things, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. But a lot of times things are from childhood experiences. Now, for those of us who are parents and we may have a child in addiction, this is not meant to point the finger or to have a guilt trip, because it's not necessarily from parents. A lot of times, especially this is a problem in our country, and I don't know how it is in India, but bullying is enormous and an enormous factor in a child's life. When they're made fun of at school or in the neighborhood, when they're abused. But there are things such as sexual abuse that happens that may not be in the family at all, or it may be a relative, or again, somebody in the neighborhood or whatever. But all of those factors are a child's experience, and they don't know what to do with it. And so the thing I want you to really take from this is the desire is to numb the pain that they don't know what to do with. It's there, it never goes away unless they get help, and it's rare for that to happen. And when we say it can be destructive to the individual, but also to those around them. And so if you have somebody in the family structure who you can see is destroying their lives, and you try to help and you try to get them to go someplace to a rehab, or get counseling or whatever, and they refuse, and that person becomes the central focus of that family. They become almost like an obsession to the people in the family, because this is somebody that they love, who they want to do well, and they just won't. So that's really important. The concept that it's a coping skill. So we all cope with life in different ways. Hopefully our ways of coping with life are spiritually driven, of understanding that Jesus Christ is our life, and that we're not looking to the world around us to be able to help us cope with all of the things that were going on. I mean, fear was an enormous factor during COVID-19. It was like that enemy that was unseen. We couldn't protect our loved ones. We couldn't protect ourselves against it when this all started, and people reacted in so much fear. And so we tried to find ways to cope with that. And when somebody does not have the skills, does not have that personal, deep relationship with Jesus. They don't have coping skills that are healthy necessarily. So I want to talk about the three types of addiction, or three categories of addiction, because a lot of times we think about drugs and alcohol as being addiction, but there are far, far more types than that. So the first is obviously addiction to a substance, such as drugs, alcohol, tobacco, food, caffeine. Yes, we need food. But there are people who use food as a coping mechanism. And it's a way of dealing with life that can become very unhealthy. And I say caffeine just because I grew up in a family of coffee drinkers. I'm not one of them. I don't even like hot beverages at all, but caffeine is a very real addiction, even though it doesn't deeply impact our lives unless you're without it. Like if you have to have surgery or something and they tell you you can't have coffee that morning or something, boy, you know you're addicted then. The headache and all. That one is a very mild one. So I put it in there mostly just to make the point. But the second type is addiction to a behavior, such as pornography, gambling, eating disorders, sex, sports, work, and shopping. Some of those may step on our toes a little bit because we see it as a really good thing to work hard. And it is a good thing to be involved in sports. Maybe you are working out. But the enemy can take any good thing and pervert it into a not good thing. And so anything that is taken to extreme, that takes over a person's life, that can be an addiction. In this country, pornography is an epidemic. And we don't think of pornography in the same category as drugs or alcohol, but it is equally destructive to relationships and to that person. And it is an addiction in the same way that heroin would be. The third type is addiction to relationships. And you might say, what? But this is looking at relationships such as dysfunctional relationships like codependency or abuse and domination of another person. Did you know that people can be anger addicts? That is something that was brand new to me a number of years ago, and I began to understand a very dysfunctional relationship that I was in at that time. But when somebody habitually are similar to the hormones that are released in sex or in any pleasurable thing. And so you think this person is raging at me and they're angry, they're not enjoying this at all. But what is happening actually is after that, they get the same release of hormones and it becomes addictive. And so that's one that we don't think about very often, but it's very, very real. So I would like to talk about the myths of addiction, and we could probably spend a whole section or a whole session on the myths because there are so many of them, and especially the first one, and that is that addiction is a disease. Now, in this country, if you talk to most doctors, they will say addiction is a disease. I don't know if that is being taught in India. I assume it would be. And I cannot spend time on this, but if you're able to get a hold of my book, I do have a whole chapter on why addiction is not a disease. There are very good books written on this by well-known scientists and addiction specialists. And there are some from all over the world who have actually signed a document saying, no, addiction is not a disease. And not only is it not a disease, but it's destructive to see it as a disease. And just very briefly, the reason that it is destructive goes into the second myth, and that is that addiction can never be cured. So when somebody is in addiction and they're told they have the disease of addiction, they are told that they will never be free from it, that they will deal with this the rest of their life, and that it's very normal to relapse. Now, if you're dealing with any of the opioids in addiction, you are dealing with the proverbial loaded gun, playing Russian roulette. And you don't know that the next time that you take a hit, that's not going to be the end for you. So it is a major problem to relapse. And so our government has come out with a document, and one of the things that I put in the book is they talk about that addiction relapse is normal and to be expected, and it just means that we need to change the treatment of that. Well, that person may not have that next time, depending on what they're using. This is so pernicious, but in this country, there's a new substance that's being added in with the fentanyl, with the heroin, and it's called xylazine. On the street, they call it tranq. And it's being mixed in, and it is animal tranquilizer. And so Narcan does not reverse it. And so when somebody takes a dose that is laced with xylazine, which is becoming more and more common in the drug supply in this country, they likely will die from overdose. But the other thing is, even if they don't die, xylazine causes massive infections in the site of the injection, and that becomes gangrenous. And so people are having amputations as a result of the xylazine. So when somebody makes addiction sound normalized and that you can never be free from it, people do not have hope. It takes away any idea of being free from this addiction. And so therefore, well, I'm just going to do more because I'm never going to get free from this. And that is a lie from the pit of hell. That is Satan trying to persuade people to keep doing what is destructive to them. The third one is that families need to help their addicted loved one. If somebody has a disease, let's say one of your children or your loved ones had cancer, you would do everything possible to get them to the right doctor, to get them to the right hospital. You would pay all of the money that you have to be able to help them. But unfortunately, that's the worst thing that you could do when somebody is in addiction, because our helping actually becomes enabling of their addiction. And there's a quote that I found recently that says, enabling isn't helping, it's escaping from our uncomfortable emotions. So we feel uncomfortable just saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you money. I'm sorry that you're going into dope sickness. But no, I'm not going to give you money for drugs. No, you can't stay in my house if you are using, because you're putting the family at risk, and I would be enabling you. And so I can't do that. So again, these are topics all on their own as far as sessions, but I can only touch on them here. The fourth one is that I was born this way. So my great-grandfather was an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic. My father was an alcoholic, or my mother was. And so therefore I'm an alcoholic, or I'm a drug addict. I inherited addiction, and that is not true. That is a myth. There has not been any gene that has been identified that says you will become an addict. And our environment is much more important in looking at addiction than our genes are. Are there people who have a personality type that's addiction? I said that about my son, in a sense, but his addiction, as he will say now, was really based on emotional pain. It wasn't a personality type. And so that is a myth. But when you are raised, if let's say you're raised in a home where one of your parents was an alcoholic, that is a chaotic way to live as a child. And so there are deep emotional issues that come from being raised in that situation. So we have to look at some generational curse or something like that sometimes people will point to. And then I wanted to add two more. And these aren't on the notes, and I'm sorry about that. I'm a work in progress. So the next one is, I'm only hurting myself. That is not true. The estimate is that for every person in addiction, there are at least 5 to 10 people who are directly impacted by that addiction. Addiction is one of the most selfish states of being in the world, because it is all about me. It is all about soothing the pain inside. And the further we get into addiction, the more we need the soothing. So it's not just the early things that happened to us, but it keeps going. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then the last one I call, just stop it. So there are people who will say, just stop drinking. Like, it's that simple. Just stop using drugs. Like, you don't have to do this. It's just an act of the will. And unfortunately, there are some well-meaning, even Christian counselors that will say that. And they don't understand the deep roots of addiction. To them, it's a behavior. But addiction is so much more. It is a behavior, but it is so much more than that. So I want to talk in the next section about what are the roots of addiction. So to really understand addiction, we have to go beyond the substances and beyond the behaviors. So I say that there are 4 major roots. So picture a tree, and you've got deep roots going down into the ground. And these are the 4 that I've identified as being major ones. The first one is rejection. The second one is trauma. The third one is rebellion. And the fourth one is shame. And I wish we had time to go into all of those. If you're studying the Grace Fellowship method of biblical counseling, the exchange life counseling process, you know that Dr. Solomon talked much about rejection. And rejection really cuts to the core of our being. As a child, as an adult, it doesn't matter. Rejection is enormous. And so there are people who had happy childhood, but they were severely rejected in school And when I say childhood, like at home, but severely rejected in school. Or maybe it was a relationship when they first started dating and they thought this was the person they were going to marry, and they found somebody else and rejected them. And so rejection is a really key component that we see in addiction. Trauma. There was a study that was done in this country of what they call adverse childhood experiences, and they abbreviate it as ACEs. And this was a very large study done by a major medical center in this country. And what they determined is that the more adverse childhood experiences that somebody had, the higher the risk of going into addiction. And that's a study that you could look up if you just Google ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. You could see that. The third one is rebellion. So think about Satan in Isaiah, I think it was 14, where he talked about, I will be as the Most High. I will do this. I will do that. And because we are children of Satan, in a sense, before we give our lives to Jesus, we are the offspring of Adam and Eve. And so we inherited that sinful nature. And we also, even after we get saved, after we become a child of God and have a new spirit, we still retain the flesh. We still have the ability to walk in the flesh. And so there are people who, because of unresolved things that they have gone through, they choose to walk in the flesh. Or if they're not a believer, they walk according to what their rebellious ancestors, Adam and Eve, did. And so rebellion, I mean, there are kids that are born that you think, I always said that one of my daughters was born telling the doctor he was doing it wrong. Like, she knew instinctively the right way to do everything, and it needed to be her way. Now, thankfully, she has come out of that, and she's wonderful. And she's having my first grandchild, well, my second grandchild, in a few months. So that's really wonderful. But the idea is that as we are born, we all have that old nature. And until we commit that to God and receive his salvation, we can be very rebellious. And then the fourth one, and this is what I want to spend a little bit more time on, and that is the area of shame. I was talking to a friend the other night who has had so much abuse in her life, so much trauma. And she said to me, I am just full of shame. She said, I think instead of blood, I have shame running through my veins. I feel shame all the time. And that was brilliant that she said that. And that's on the path to getting well from it, is recognizing that that's what is true. And she is currently going through counseling and doesn't want to stay there. But shame is really under all of those things. And so we can see that as the most pervasive root of addiction. So what happened in the Garden of Eden? When Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent, and he deceived Eve, and Adam chose to disobey God, and they took of that fruit, what was the immediate thing that happened? They immediately, yes, their eyes were opened, they knew good and evil, but immediately shame came into their lives. What was their response? They hid. They knew they were naked. They tried sewing together the leaves so that they wouldn't show their nakedness anymore. And so from the very beginning, shame entered the world. Sin entered the world, and it brought shame with it. So a lot of times people misunderstand the concept of guilt versus shame. So guilt is, I did something wrong. I am guilty of whatever it is. Shame is, I am wrong. I was made wrong. There is something flawed in me. I am less than. And so that sense of being deeply flawed, of being not as good as other people, of that deep sense of shame can lead to addiction. Now, sometimes people will cover that sense of shame with doing things that we talk about at Grace Fellowship as good flesh. Okay. Bill Gillum used to call it grade A prime flesh, instead of the bad flesh or the yucky flesh, as he called it. But both of them are flesh. Both of them are living out of our own resources and not living out of God's resources. And so addiction is a feeble attempt to be able to solve the problem of shame. So remember, I was talking about addiction has to do with numbing. And
American specific for counseling.
are we okay? I hear voices. Okay, I'll just keep going. The only thing that addiction does is it feeds the fuel of shame. And so addiction is self-perpetuating. It creates more shame and negative consequences. And then that causes the person to want to numb more. And so it's this vicious cycle that the more shame there is, the more they want to mask the shame, the more they want to numb the shame. The more they numb the shame, it creates unwanted consequences and guilt feelings and more shame. And so they continue down that path. There's a counselor who works in Vancouver, Canada, and her name is Stephanie Lee. And I love this quote from her. She said, addiction originates in a human being's desperate attempt to solve a problem, the problem of emotional pain, of overwhelming stress, of lost connection, of loss of control, of a deep discomfort with the self. In short, it is a forlorn attempt to solve the problem of human pain. Hence my mantra, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. So shame promotes addiction, and addiction perpetuates shame. So let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about how God sees addiction. When the Israelites left Egypt, went through the wilderness, entered the promised land, God told them to wipe out the people that were living there because he was afraid that and he knew that they would be pulled away to idols. And so we don't think of idols in the same way these days. I don't have a golden calf out in my yard that I worship or anything. You don't see that, but we still have idols. And so if we define an idol as anything that we put above God, we all have idols in our lives. It may be our kids. It may be our job. It may be our church even. But if we put it above God, if we are worshiping that thing, then we have idols. Dr. Carl Benzio said this, addiction is choosing or pursuing something other than God in a habitual, patterned, or repetitive way, in order to meet a particular need, despite the inadequacy of the coping mechanism and the negative consequences that occur. So addiction is not about the substance, behavior, or relationship ultimately. Addiction is idolatry. And so it is a spiritual idolatry problem stemming from the deep-seated soul issues. And it has a detrimental effect on our body, our relationships, our financial issues, and legal consequences. It's placing the desire for numbing above God rather than finding true healing in God. And so therefore it is an idol. And that's how God sees it. Now, is God condemning the person who is in addiction because they're in addiction? No. God loves all of us in all of our addictions. I always joke that I'm addicted to chocolate or lip gloss. I have a lip gloss everywhere in my house, in every pocket. I have lip gloss. That's my particular addiction, but that one's pretty harmless. But the reality is that all of us can have an addiction, and that becomes an idol in our lives. So we need to examine ourselves in this also. But just very briefly, I want to talk about the solutions for addiction. And again, this could be a whole other session in itself. And so I'm just kind of whetting your appetite. In this country, we talk about drinking from a fire hose sometimes. I don't know if that translates to you, but if you picture a fire hose and all the water that's coming out, that's what this session is like. So I want to whet your appetite for more study on this, for more understanding. So the solutions for addiction, I like to talk about distorted identity versus transformed identity. When we are in addiction, or certainly before we are saved, and then even afterwards, this can be true. But our distorted identity oftentimes is built on our experiences in life, our shame. And that is in contrast to a transformed identity, which is being able to embrace the exchanged life that God gave us. So Galatians 2:20, and I'm sure all of you know that verse. It is one of the most important verses in all of the Bible. But it says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So when Jesus died on the cross, I died with him. My identity is no longer that I am a daughter of Adam and Eve. I am a daughter of the Most High God. And God is not looking at me with disgust. When I stumble, when I live in the flesh, when I make poor choices, he is looking at me and at you with love and compassion and grace based on what Jesus did on the cross. And so the hope for addiction is to help people begin to understand their transformed identity so that they don't live in shame, so they don't live in rebellion and in the trauma that happened to them and in the rejection, so that they are able to see life in a totally different way. So sometimes if you get sunglasses, sometimes they will be colored, like maybe pink or blue or something, and you put them on and everything around you looks that shade. So think of the distorted identity as that, or in this country, we have something they call a fun house, or a house of mirrors, and the mirrors will be all weird shapes, and so you may be very slender, but you look in the one mirror and you look like you're huge. Okay. And then another mirror will make you look like you're a little tiny thing. Okay. That's the distorted identity. Somebody, like I mentioned eating disorders as an addiction, and I never thought of that as an addiction before I did a lot of studying on this, but somebody who has anorexia, where they think they're fat and they are skin and bones, literally. They are so thin that eventually it may take their life as a result of malnutrition. But they look in the mirror and their distorted identity is that I am fat. And that's how they see themselves. And so Jesus came so that we didn't have to have that distorted identity anymore. We do not have to see ourselves as a sinner. And even the phrase that's very common in this country is, I'm only a sinner saved by grace. No, that is not true. Yes, we were sinners. Yes, we were saved by grace, but that is not my identity. That is a distorted identity. Paul talks in all of the epistles to the saints, all of them. And so instead of I'm only a sinner saved by grace, which locks me into being a sinner still, I am a saint who occasionally sins. So that is that transformed identity based on Jesus, not on our own attributes. There's a praise song that I like, and I don't know if you have the same one there, but it has a phrase in it that says, I'm no longer a slave to sin. I am a child of God. So living our true identity is the key, not living the lie of slavery to sin and the flesh. Now, the second part of the solution is doing the hard work of dealing with our pain, with our trauma, our rejection, our rebellion, and our shame. So I know that Dr. John Woodward next week is going to be talking with you all about taking a history. And I won't steal any of his thunder. I won't steal his talk at all. But if you are working with people, taking an in-depth history of tracing the areas of trauma, tracing the areas of shame, tracing the areas of rejection is so crucial. Learning to ask questions that draw somebody out, not just, okay, well, this was my family and I had this many siblings and my parents did this and we lived here and that. Okay, what was the impact in your family? What were the dynamics? What was it like for you in school? So I'm not going to get into John's talk. That's for him to do next week. But it's in being able to deal with our own issues. We need to constantly be healing and growing and being honest about the things that have happened to us. And then also being transparent with other people. And as they are seeking help, being able to talk through those areas of pain and shame, especially, and point them to a transformed identity that they will be growing and learning and all of that process of sanctification until we get to heaven, until Jesus comes back for us or he promotes us to glory. And may he come soon. That would be wonderful. But the privilege of being able to help other people in understanding who they truly are in Christ. So that was a lot. Hopefully I didn't drown you all with the fire hose, but if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. And forgive me, I know that there are accent differences, so if I don't understand, please just know it's my fault, not yours. So I'm not sure how to handle this, but feel free to jump in with questions if you have them.
Thank you. That was very insightful message.
Thank you.
Yeah. I just want you to repeat what you said in the beginning, that it is a soul manifestation. I didn't get that. It's addiction. It's in the beginning that you stated that.
Yes. Yes. What I said is addiction is a soul problem with physical manifestations and a spiritual solution. Okay. And that is in the notes, just in case I said it too quickly. So when we talk about the soul, we're talking about our thinker, our feeler, and our chooser. And so our emotions are devastated when we feel rejection, when we feel shame. Our mind can be very twisted in the attempts to deal with that root pain. And then we choose things that we think will numb or will help us feel better. And I think we've all done this. We're having a bad day. And so what do? We go find a chocolate bar or something like that. So that's a very mild way of dealing with it. But somebody who is in addiction to, especially to a substance, they choose very dangerous things and things that take over their life. Okay, good question.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So
anybody else?
Yes, basically, it's not just somebody filling themselves with something. It's a deeper thing. And
yes,
so often we just say, okay, this guy is not listening, or this girl is not listening, and we fail to see what is behind it. Thank you so much.
Yes, yes, that is so true. Because so many times we want to treat it as a behavior problem. Just stop. Like, don't do that anymore. But that's not looking at the reasons that somebody is in. That doesn't give the person an excuse. That's where the disease model gives them an excuse. Well, I have the disease of addiction, so therefore I can't do anything about it. No, that's not true. Yes, there are things in the brain that are changed. There are neural pathways that are changed in the brain. And it takes time for somebody to be able to break those pathways, to break those patterns. But that's why we talk about it is a habit. So if you have a habit of, like, I know people that bite their nails, and it becomes a habit, and you would say, just stop biting your nails. Like, why do you do that? But they don't stop because it is a deep habit. It is an addiction. Even though they're not going to die from it, it doesn't affect their relationships so much or whatever, but that is a habit. And just to tell somebody, like, stop it. Well, that doesn't work, right?
But that a habit of biting nails also goes back to a deeper problem of fear or nervousness. And they do
Yes.
that. So
yes.
they stop that
Based on shame is at the root of all of that. So when I feel ashamed, when I feel a sense of my world is out of control because of what has been done to me, think of a person who has been sexually abused as a child, and they don't feel they have any control when this is happening. They don't know what to do. They're afraid to tell somebody. They're afraid that they will be blamed. And they're afraid that the reason this person is doing it to me is because I am less than. And so that feeds the shame. A lot of times what they will do is try to control their world afterwards so that nobody ever gets close to them. And as strange as it may seem, nail biting can be part of that. Yes, it is a nervous manifestation of that, but it's something I can control. Nobody can make me stop biting my nails. I know they used to put like some kind of yucky tasting stuff on them or put gloves on or whatever, but ultimately the person would be able to avoid that. So I always wondered why somebody would be in jail for 6 months and come out and immediately go back into addiction. Why is that? Those neural patterns were changed in jail. You know, they're not getting the drug in there or the alcohol. So I know somebody who went through what we call cold turkey, heroin withdrawal on the floor of a jail cell, you know, puking, diarrhea, the whole bit for days. It just horrible pain, all of that. And he was released from jail, and somebody had broken into his house, stole a bunch of money from him. And all he cared about was that he had heroin that they hadn't taken. So here he had gone through withdrawal. And you would say, why do you go back? Why would you put yourself through the possibility of going back? But he did, because the root issues were still there. Nothing had changed. So even though physically he had withdrawn, it didn't matter. Okay. Any other questions?
Ma'am, I just want to ask you that how can we get out of addiction? How somebody can get out of addiction? Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Getting out of addiction is a process of removing that person or them making the decision to not be, that they don't want to be in addiction anymore. So we talk about, you know, the parable that Jesus gave of the prodigal son. And it wasn't until that prodigal son came to that place of the pig pen that he looked up and said, oh my goodness, my father's servants have it so much better than I do. He came to that place of total brokenness because, as you know, for the Jewish people, pigs were forbidden to eat. And he was in the middle of slop, feeding the pigs. That was the only way he could stay alive. And so one of the things that we need to do is to not enable that person to continue doing what they're doing. The word enable, just very simply, the definition in the dictionary says to make able. And so if I am allowing somebody that I love to live in my house, feeding them, paying their fines, bailing them out of jail, giving them money. I know of a woman who had her son who was addicted to heroin living with her. She would literally give him money and drive him to the drug house to buy the drugs because she could not stand the idea of him going through withdrawal. And so she ended up going into bankruptcy, losing the place that she lived. She had a good job. She had plenty of money to take care of herself, but she was giving it all to her son, and he was draining her dry. She actually lost 30 pounds because she wasn't buying food for herself. She was only giving him money. So she was as addicted as he was. So breaking the cycle and understanding, enabling. Not everybody that enables is codependent, but everybody that's codependent enables. And so I teach that our loved one is addicted to drugs or alcohol, and we are addicted to our loved one. So that's a form of addiction also. So stopping enabling, allowing them to experience the consequences of their actions. So when you have a little kid and you don't like something that's happening to them, you know, you try to protect them. That's part of nurturing. But as they get older, sometimes what we do is we think we're nurturing, and our child or our husband or wife or parents or whoever are fully functional and able to make choices. But we kind of scoop them off of God's timeout chair, and we rescue them, and we don't allow them to experience the consequences of their choices to be made well, that they will be. So Jesus talked to the man at the pool of Bethesda, and he was walking through, and the man was lame and from childhood, and he couldn't get up. And Jesus didn't immediately say to him, "You're made well." He asked him a question, and he said, "Do you want to be made well? Do you want to?" Because sometimes people are so stuck in their lives that they can't see anything else. And so that's the question. As we're working with people who are in addiction, or as we're dealing with a loved one, the question is, do you want to be made well? And if you don't want to be made well, then I will pray for you, but I'm not going to enable your addiction. But then as counselors, as people helpers, if somebody comes to us and says, "I am addicted to alcohol and I don't want to live this way anymore," it's again going through the history-taking process and being able to identify areas of pain, invite Jesus into that pain, into that memory, and allow him to heal it. And then helping them learn that process of sanctification, helping them understand their new identity. Okay, that is the process that the place I grew up at, the Colony of Mercy, they use that in being able to help people be set free. And so the name of my book is Set Free for a reason. It's not just, okay, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to try this. And no, it's being set free by God, because ultimately he's the only one who can set anybody free from any of our addictions. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Okay,
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Ji, ma'am.
you're welcome.
Can you give us some more books that we could look through in the same about addiction and getting free from addiction? Any other author that you can, or have you got more books than this one book?
I have 2 books, actually. The first one that I wrote was written as the curriculum for the support group that I lead on Monday nights for women who have loved ones in addiction. And it's called Beside Still Waters, Discovering Peace in the Midst of Your Child's Addiction. That one is available on Amazon. It's in Kindle form. I don't know with the international market how that works. But the second one is a more comprehensive book on addiction. And so if you had to choose one, if you have access to it, I would choose the second one. There are other people who have written on addiction. Mike Quarles and Steve McVeigh wrote Helping Others Overcome Addiction. That's a very good book. There aren't a lot that teach from the exchanged life perspective. And so I'm not trying to sell books at all, please believe me. But this was a labor of love for about 1.5 years that I spent writing this, and it covers what I have taught in much more depth. So again, I don't know what the access would be to the book, but I know that the publisher that I went through has enabled international distribution, but I don't know what that looks like. And I don't know if you are able to buy from Amazon US.
Yeah.
If you are, then the book is on there. I am in the process of, well, Amazon was not listing the book properly. They were doing it from a third party. And so as soon as one thing is done, I would wait maybe about a week because I'm in the process of publishing it again through Amazon, and then it'll be available on Prime and all of that. But it is listed on there, and it definitely is listed on Kindle if you're able to get the ebook. And very exciting, it will now be on audio. That is in process. A friend of mine donated his wonderful voice to put the book on audio. And so for those of you who do that, again, that will be available on Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. So that should be about the middle of May that will be available.